Start? Jojo, are you ready?
I'm here.
Okay. Right. So let's start. Thanks to everyone for joining this seminar. Thanks for your time. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. Okay, my name is Yoshinori Nishizaki. I'm the faculty member of the Department of Southeast Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm the coordinator of the seminar series in our department this semester. We have organized 4 seminars this semester. They center on the broad theme of contentious politics in Southeast Asia. Today's seminar is the last of these 4. And we are very fortunate and privileged to have Professor Patricio Jojo Abinales as a speaker. Jojo really needs no introduction, especially in Filipino studies. But very briefly, he is the graduate of the University of the Philippines and Cornell. And after having taught at Ohio University and Kyoto University in Japan, he's now teaching in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii. He is the author of numerous works on various aspects of Filipino politics, history, and society. Among these works is my favorite book, Making Mindanao, Cotabato, and Davao in the Formation of the Philippine nation state. I learned a great deal from this book while writing a dissertation, my dissertation on the strongman in rural Thailand. Jojo is also the co-author of another highly acclaimed and widely cited book, State and Society in the Philippines. Today, he's going to give a talk titled The Missing Local in the Duterte Studies Industry. I believe he'll be taking a critical look at the mainstream scholarship on Duterte's controversial yet highly popular presidency from a local perspective. And I think he is in a particularly good position to talk about this issue because he is from one part of Mindanao, not too far away from Davao, where Duterte grew up. Okay, so without further ado, let me hand this over to Jojo. And as usual, the talk will last for about 45 minutes to be followed by another 45 minutes of Q&A. If you have any question, you don't have to write it and send it to me. Just send a memo to me to say you have a question, or simply click the hand button on your computer during the Q&A, and I'll call on you. Okay, so that said, it's all yours, Jojo. Again, it's great to have you. It's great to see you again after so many years.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Okay, so good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Before anything else, I would like to thank the Department of Southeast Asian Studies faculty and Yoshi Nishizaki for inviting me. I have to read this. Okay? So when Yoshi asked me a few months ago if I was interested in giving a talk, I told him I wasn't sure what to talk about. Yoshi suggested that I discuss the coming 2020 general elections in the Philippines, and I demurred, saying that soon there will be hundreds of YouTube videos of various quote-unquote experts making predictions about that event and trying to introduce insights that will make the others sound pedestrian. Besides, I said to myself, I like history more, and I find in many of this punditry and theorizing the problem which E.P. Thompson had warned us about when he wrote, and I quote E.P. Thompson, "Minds which thirst for a tidy platonism very soon become impatient with actual history." But it was while thinking about Thompson's entreaty that I reconsidered Yoshi's offer and told him that I'd like to look at the career of President Rodrigo Duterte as he goes into the last year of his presidency. So I agreed, and then I found myself checking out the University of Hawaii Library collection, what the library has on him. A search under the title President Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte, yielded 15,798 citations, rough citations, making Duterte the 3rd most studied president of the Philippines after Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, Ferdinand Marcos, and he's slightly ahead of Joseph Estrada. The rest of the presidents lagged far behind. Note here that Arroyo and Marcos have more citations because they rule beyond their official tenure. So Corazon Aquino is 9,237, San Benigno is 5,519, and Fidel Ramos, 3,836. Then I decided to break down the list, and I have so far listed down 8 books. You have it, this 8 books, including this very strange book by Ryoho Okawa titled Samurai President of the Philippines, Spiritual Interview with the Guardian Spirit of Rodrigo Duterte. I found 2 book chapters, 1 dissertation, 103 journal essays, 4 films, and a conference presentation on the president himself. So it was obvious that there was sufficient reason to merit and suggest to Yoshi the term Duterte Studies Industry, or DSI, my impish use of the acronym, here inspired by how social media describes Duterte's following, diehard Duterte supporters. So this is DSI on DDS. I then began to look at some of the works and immediately noticed how the majority showed no interest in Duterte's local beginnings, and very few cited local sources that could help us understand better his unusual rise to power. And the first mayor who went straight to the president in the country's history. But that was not all. First, none of the DSI has so far come out with a convincing explanation as to why a substantial number of Filipinos remain enamored with Duterte. The nearest to a credible one would be the poll surveys that show a high correlation between his popularity and the Filipinos' sense of security. There's also a tendency in many of the DSI authors to just assume that Duterte's callous language and boorish, brutal behavior were unprecedented. And here, let me qualify, there are, of course, exceptions to the DSI. To name a few, the sociologist Joel Canuday was born in Davao and is now at Ateneo de Manila University. The political scientist Soledad Iglesias, who just finished her dissertation at the NUS. The historian Alfred W. McCoy, University of Wisconsin, and the Nagoya anthropologist Wataru Kosaka. But they remain a pitiful minority. And so I continued to feel that there was something missing, and so I accepted Yoshi's invitation. Let me start with the June 4, 1916 quote-unquote Thanksgiving speech of President-elect Duterte to his supporters at Davao City's Crocodile Park, a wildlife park that was perhaps apt for the occasion. As he was closing his long-winded discourse, Duterte expressed frustration first towards his defeated rival, Secretary of Local Government Mar Rojas, who insisted during the campaign that Duterte, who was in his 70s, show a medical certificate declaring him fit to run as president. In his speech, Duterte said that maybe what they should do, the two of them should do instead, is to pull down each other's pants and compare their manhood, saying that Rojas is smaller. Okay? He then directed his anger at journalists who kept asking him the same questions. He told those journalists in the audience how they would feel if he would inquire about their wives having vaginitis. If you watch the video, you will notice that the crowd erupted in laughter at what Duterte had said, while his Manila allies who were in the platform were all clueless. And for a moment, I confess, I too found myself laughing along with the crowd. It took me a few minutes to realize that I heard these kinds of histrionics before, and they did not come from politicians. Instead, I heard similar words and phrases coming out of the mouths of some of my God-fearing aunts and their friends while growing up in the northern Mindanao town of Ozamis. My lovely aunts would be at their most foul-mouthed and would issue outrageous statements, especially when confronting wayward boyfriends or husbands. They would regale us with the dirtiest of ditties, especially when they are inebriated during burials, burial wakes, or family reunions. So it was while remembering all this that I realized how emblematic Duterte's speech was of this disconnect within the DSI's attempt to examine his political resilience and his local context. So with your indulgence, what I would like to do this afternoon, this evening, is to share with you some tentative, underscore tentative explanation as to Davao's glaring absence in the DSI, starting with the view that Duterte's vulgarity and viciousness are new to Philippine politics. A quick look at Philippine history suggests that these were not. Consider the following description of the politician Manuel Quezon, and I quote, "When Quezon was campaigning against the HHC Act, this is a congressional act in the US Congress was debating over how to implement Philippine independence, in Tanawan, Batangas, a country dominated by Jose P. Laurel, his rival, Quezon was greeted coolly. Quezon then spotted a cross-eyed man and said, 'Hey, utang ina mong duling, what are you doing there?' Here. To roughly translated, 'Hey, you cross-eyed son of a bitch, what are you doing here?' Quezon, according to the historian Carlos Quirino, then, quote, placed his arm around the shoulder of the cross-eyed man, who smiled broadly in return. This touch of friendliness thawed out the crowd. Good-natured laughter rose, then cheers followed by applause. Needless to add, the political meeting was a success. 'Who was that cross-eyed man whom you greeted, Mr. President?' asked one of his henchmen after the meeting. 'I'll be damned if I know his name,' replied Quezon. 'This is the first time I have ever seen him in my life.' Manuel Quezon, a town prosecutor who began his political career as a protege of an American constabulary officer, became president of the Philippine Commonwealth, the transition regime before granting Philippine independence. Journalists frequently cite his favorite curse words, puñeta, which in Filipino could mean three things: having sex, moving one's bowels, or expressing anger by clenching one's fist at someone else. Now, but going by the encounter he had with Tuling, it is clear that he knew more than this derivative of the Spanish hijo de puta. Neither was Quezon alone in this. Anyone growing up in the provinces in the Philippines watching campaign speeches is familiar with such tirades, especially when spoken in the language or dialect of the area. The audience would often reciprocate with their own sexual ditties, like the one I remember from my childhood about a vice presidential candidate named Fernando Lopez. The Visayan song is very short. It says, "Si Fernando Po Lopez, walay carsones, ang utin talines sa public service." I'm sure the Visayans would understand this. Roughly translated and sung to the tune of the American children's song On Top of Spaghetti, it went like this: "Fernando Po Lopez has no pants. His penis is so sharp for public service." His middle name in this ditty is Po, which is not really his, but the surname of an action star who also had the first name Fernando. Now, how about Duterte's advocacy for brutality and misogyny? Again, Duterte's use of guns and golds appear to be hardly unique. Here, for example, is the news from the September 2, 2009 report, newspapers about an incident involving the former governor of Ilocos Sur, Luis Chavit Singson. According to the news reports, his common law wife, now I can use my pen. His common law wife, expand, common law wife, Rachel Tiongson, who has 5 children by Singson, filed a complaint against him for violating Republic Act 9262, or the Anti-Violence Against Women and Children Act, forbidding her up as well as her male friend at her apartment. When interviewed, Singson told his side of the story, saying, that a year before, quote, I caught her with a young actor. Instead, he forgave her, agreed to her request that they should not separate, and even found her an apartment adjacent to their house in one of the most expensive golden ghettos of Manila, quote, for the sake of the children, unquote. Singson, however, ordered his bodyguard to surveil Chongson and caught her with another man. He said he confronted both at her apartment but refused to say whether he did the beating or ordered his bodyguards to do it. Singson said they were only beaten and punished, adding that she should consider herself lucky because he was a good person, and that if it were another man who caught her, both would have wound up dead. I am a good person, unquote, so I did not kill them. I did not have them killed. I'm sorry. I just told her to leave the house, Singson said. An investigative reporter was able to piece a starker picture. Ellen Tordesillas wrote in her blog, and I am translating in Filipino here, the public witnessed Chavez's inhumane treatment of Chongson, the mother of his 5 children, after he caught her with her boyfriend. She was whipped like an animal. The talk was that this bodyguard beat her boyfriend naked. Some even said that he used a hammer to bash his penis. I don't know if this is true. The public also saw Singson's arrogant response and his claims that he was on the right and that they were lucky that he did not have them killed. Today, Singson is in the crew of the famous boxer Manny Pacquiao and owns the franchise to the Miss Universe contest. Okay, not bad for a former town police chief of Ilocosur who became the province's strongman in the late 60s after having a rival, a powerful congressman, allegedly assassinated while the latter was attending mass. Okay? Now, what puts Duterte in a class of his own is, as the DSI rightly points out, he's turning the viciousness of local politics into a national staple. But we have here very little from the DSI when it comes to the question of how all these things came to be. How is it that this local argot is now part of the national language? Okay. Now, let me try to venture a couple of explanations here. Again, underscore tentative. The first has to do with the nationalization of television and how this impacted Davao politics. In the mid-1980s, the 4 major television networks began opening stations in the provinces outside of the 2 big cities, Manila and Cebu. In the beginning, these stations were only airing Manila shows, but by the 1990s, they began to produce their own quote-unquote provincial news segments and variety shows in the local languages. Then in 1998, Congressman Duterte, then representing the 1st District of Davao City, did something he had never done, that had never been done by any politician in Mindanao. He put up his own Sunday talk show on the Davao channel of the largest television network, ABS-CBN, which he had forced to close last year, I think, where he would supposedly respond to the concerns of his constituents. My friend, the Davao journalist and editor of Minda News, Caroline Arguellas, wrote that the show would ensure his continued presence among the Davaoenos, whom he had served as mayor from 1988. But Duterte was hit by the 3-term limit and therefore had to run for Congress. And hence he became Davao City's first congressman, an elected position he found very boring, but which gave him time to bond with his daughter Sarah, then a law student in Manila, unquote. Duterte called his show Gikan sa Masa para sa Masa, a translation from Mao Zedong's famous phrase, from the masses to the masses, already hinting at some influence of left-wing politics on him. And every Sunday morning, Davaoenos would watch in delight as Duterte spewed bile, issued threats, and smeared political rivals, of this mixed with funny asides and fatherly advice to his audience. The audience ratings for Gikan sa Masa para sa Masa easily topped the television edition of the Catholic Church's Sunday Mass and the preaching of non-Catholic ministries. Everyone eagerly awaited the show, and you would hear a collective lament if he was not available. It's another picture of Duterte. Those of you who are Visayan can probably figure out what's being written here. This is a more recent version of Ikan Samasa when he was president now. But it's a very the language extremely delightful because it's like really real Visayan talking, appealing to the president. Now, politicians in other provinces began to copy Duterte and produce their own versions. These politicians were not as colorful as he was, but it was clear to these local strongmen that television had become a more effective way to reach out to their constituents. Then, with the advent of YouTube in 2005 and Facebook's video platform in 2007, the reach expanded beyond their localities and provinces and even reached audiences abroad. Second, there is also the wall dividing the official language of the nation state and the coarse argot of local power, which Duterte would break down. The latter is used to attract provincial, city, and town mates in public meetings, campaign stops, and backroom deals, while the former is deployed for national and international affairs. Now, even the foul-mouthed of provincial, city, and town bosses could turn diplomatic once he or she found himself or herself in the halls of Congress, the executive office, or when talking to embassy representatives and officers of the international aid agencies. My favorite example here was the local boss of my hometown. The Asian Development Bank released a closure report of the state of its aid project early, I think this decade, in Mindanao. On an inside page of the report, the bank cites then Mayor Reynaldo Parohinog as, quote, confident that the bank funded a mall, will generate more income for the city, period. With full occupancy and with the efficient collection of and use of fees, the public can be a good source of revenue for the city. He smiled, unquote. Parohinog, who in private spoke rough Visayan like me, also happened to be the leader of Coratong Balileng, which began as an anti-communist militia in the late 80s, then morphed into one of the most successful drug syndicates in Mindanao. In July 2017, the mayor, his wife, and 10 others were killed in a pre-dawn police raid ordered by Duterte, 2 blocks from our house, who had promised to wipe out the entire family. Now, so question, how would the ADB write an update about Osames in the light of Parohinog's execution? This divide between official language of the nation state and the language of local power continued unnoticed or ignored by national media or by social scientists. By the late 1990s, however, there were signs that the wall between the two political discourses was beginning to weaken. The first indication of this intermixing came up during the short reign of President Joseph Estrada, when his campaign staff came up with a brilliant tactical plan to get voters to his side. They published a collection of his alleged sayings in which he supposedly, quote-unquote, massacred the English language. The title of the book, Eruption, How to Speak English Without Really Trial, became a national bestseller. An Estrada, an action star, tough city mayor, confessed womanizer, senator whose only law passed was the preservation of the water buffalo, vice president, would win by a huge margin of 10.7 million votes over the intelligent, savvy, polished Speaker of the House, Congressman Jose de Benicia, who only received 4.2 million votes. Duterte would take this linguistic appeal a notch higher by bringing the nasty side of the vernacular of local politics with him to the presidential palace. Third, the problem with finding a plausible answer for Duterte's popularity is that the DSI seems content with all numbers, which may be useful measurements when they do not really delve, but do not really delve deeper into what these preferences meant or where they came from. They do not definitely tell people. They definitely do not tell us why people laugh at Duterte's rants. Here, I would suggest that it might be worth looking at language that Duterte and his fans appear to share. Far from seeing him as a sucker, okay, my fellow Visayans, when asked, associate Duterte with familiar characters who they simultaneously love and are worried about. He is your drunken lolo, a grandfather who was bugal-bulagalon, which is naughty, because he is a bugoy, bugay for female, is a rascal. Women, Duterte, according to my brother, was one who is prone to yaga, ridiculing, because he is good at cooking, manipulating jokes and insults. So, don't have to read the Visayan word, but Visayan with the translation, I think, is enough. Okay. The word that probably best describes this is charentism, which means an insult disguised as a jest or a compliment to fool people. Then there is that feeling among Visayans that they quote unquote own Duterte. A friend pointed out that Visayans are charmed and shocked at the same time at the sight of the president eating with his bare hands on a taxi food stall in Davao City. Nagkinamot lang karon sa karinderya, the Visayan phrase for it, saying that in doing so, he had proven himself that he is one of us. Kini ato gyud Bisaya gyud. Indeed, he is ours. Holy Visayan. Okay. These sentiments may explain why he is popular with peoples from Mindanao and Visayas, but why do non-Visayans also laugh at his rants? Again, I think it has to do with language, more specifically with what we call Davao Filipino, or alternately Davao Tagalog. In a short, very odd essay on the topic, the linguistic scholars Fiorillo A. Demetrio and Jecunia Louis Dryback cited an MA thesis, you don't have to read this first, describing Davao Tagalog as, quote, Filipino Creole continuum, unquote, similar to Singlish, consisting of two segments, the one being used by the city Cebuano population, which is sometimes called Tagdis, a portmanteau for Tagalog and Visayan, or Bislog, a portmanteau for Visayan and Tagalog, and the Davao Filipino that is being used by the city's Tagalog/Filipino population, unquote. They then went to discuss two contrasting hypotheses about the fate of Davao Filipino. The first, a linguist, argues that Davao Tagalog is, quote, a germination of the Filipino language per se, evolving into a language distinct from Tagalog. Agreeing with former University of the Philippines President Francisco Nemenzo, who is a Cebuano and speaks Visayan, that, quote, the core of the real Filipino language is the Filipino as spoken in Davao and not Balagtas Tagalog. Balagtas is an old poet from the Spanish era, spoken in Bulacan, a province north of Manila. It is, according to Nemenzo, a language and its usage should grow, and that is what's happening in Davao. Demetrio and Dreisbach, however, sided with the contrary hypothesis of not a linguist student, but a geography student, who warned that, quote, massive borrowing and emergence of various Tagalog-based varieties would eventually lead to a major language shift towards the dominant language and the homogenization of languages, thus defeating the main purpose of creating a diverse national language, unquote. I suspect the author spoke too soon. The article was put out by the Cebu-based University of San Jose Recoletos Center for Policy, Research, and Development Studies a little after Duterte became president, and so the authors may have prematurely backed the wrong horse. So to his design audience, Duterte could either speak to them in Islog or go completely Visayan in his speech. But because of Davao Tagalog, I would suggest he is also able to reach out to non-Visayans. Davao Filipino has allowed Duterte to occupy this liminal space where he can effortlessly mix both languages or shift from Visayan to Tagalog. That is a Tagalog that is an impure one because it is unlike the Tagalog-speaking provinces of Luzon. The reason for this is because Davao Filipino, according to Demetrio and Dreisbach, has quote, clauses where most words are from Tagalog Filipino and where such Tagalog Filipino words are processed using Cebuano language morphosyntactic rules. And this is enough to keep a crowd attentive, especially when spiced up with vulgarity. So in short, Duterte may still have the local bosses mentality, but thanks to Davao Tagalog, the nationalization of television, the television industry, and now social media, such provincial thoughts, which includes death threat, can now be heard across the archipelago. Fourth, from mass media and language, let me shift to coalition politics. The DSI cites how as a president, Duterte has been able to craft an electoral and governing coalition that brought together political forces, including those openly antagonistic against each other. Communists delighted in seeing their comrades appointed to cabinet posts, joining civil society groups and non-government organizations which were keen on moving in social programs, corporate types willing to keep economic growth going, and traditional politicians promising to enact laws, approve budgets, and create programs in its behalf. Again, this is not new. Historians of the colonial Philippines are familiar with Quezon's fraught relationship with the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, which he prosecuted in one instance and then allied in another, depending on the times. Chavit Singson was no different. Students of contemporary politics will recall how his revelation that President Estrada's minions had demanded he gave up control of a nationwide illegal lottery network and then tried to ambush him when he said no, were what triggered quote-unquote people power two and an institutional coup with the senior military leadership that eventually forced Estrada to resign. Singson then would metamorphose from the boss of a highly lucrative illicit activity into one of the quote people's heroes, unquote. And this was not the first time that Chavez teamed up with four-minded groups, and this is the second picture. Okay, in 1967, and the clan that dominated his province resorted to more violence, burning an entire village suspected of supporting the opposition. Chabet was one of the challengers, and he would team up with students and religious activists from Manila in rebuilding the village and protecting its inhabitants. He earned praise for this, especially since the national government and the Catholic hierarchy did not do anything. We know very little as to how Duterte formed these left-to-right coalitions because there is nothing in the DSI literature that details such arrangements. But perhaps this relatively unknown Ateneo de Davao published anthology of essays by various Davaoenos recalling their experiences during martial law may give us a hint as to where it all began. O Susana, that's the title of the book, is about the Susana building in downtown Davao City, which was unusual because of the idiosyncratic character of its habitus. In her essay, The Tenants of Susana Building, Nympha Santos Leocadio recalls that as the executive secretary of the Philippine Banana Growers and Exporters Association office, she came to know of an atypical group of people. Her boss, Paul Dominguez, who was and perhaps is still one of the city's most powerful businessmen, his brother is Duterte's Secretary of Finance, would hold meetings there with members of the association's board of directors, whose members included the economic elites of the province, executives of American transnational corporations, here's a list, and top officials of the Marcos dictatorship's Department of Agriculture. Also in the building was the office of the Banana Export Industry Foundation, okay, here, which oversaw the industry social program, and the Davao chapter of the Philippine Business for Social Progress, whose staff, first staff included former activists and left-wing writers. Now, remember some of the names, okay? Santos Diocaudo also remembered the American academic and activist Frances Morlape, who rented an office for her San Francisco-based Food First and was conducting an anti-corporate research on the growing corporate agricultural sector in Davao, as well as the staff of the Mindanao Sulu Pastoral Conference and the Mindanao Sulu Secretariat for Social Action, which the military suspected as Communist Front organization. The military was partly right because one of the Susana authors, Orlando Orly Carvajal, admitted that he was indeed one of the founders of the Christians for National Liberation, a member of the Communist Front, Communist National Democratic Front. Finally, the Susana building was the meeting place of a socio-civic organization called the Coordinating Council for Organization of Davao, CCOD. Whose directors included Jess Dureza, a close advisor of President Duterte and is in charge of all peace processes, peace negotiations with rebel groups, the powerful Davao politician, the late Manuel Nonoy Garcia, whose congressional seat is now held by his daughter, and Irene Inday Santiago, who became a member of the government tunnel in the peace talks with Muslim separatist group and once ran as vice president of the country. Joining them, again, is this guy, joining them were Paul Dominguez, Ray Teves, a social democrat, founder of the city's consumer group Consumo Davao, chair of the National Urban Poor Alliance, and then elected as representative of the party list urban poor sector in the House of Representatives, and appointed to several national government agencies afterwards. With him was also Samuel Ocenia, a co-founder of the Partido Democrático Filipino Lakas ng Bayan, which is now the party of Duterte and Manny Pacquiao, split into two factions. Closing it was Menchi Avancenia, a professor of the Ateneo de Davao University, a local Jesuit university, and an opinion writer of a newspaper, and Dante Escalante, an internal medical specialist who became famous for setting up the Davao Hospital. The head of the CCOD was Soledad Nanay Soleng, Mama Soleng Duterte, the mother the current president feared the most. So what is remarkable here, I'm sorry for the names, is how comfortable these folks were with each other, despite the differences in their class, ethnicity, political affiliations, and religions. As Carol Howe and I noted in our review of the book, Osusana makes a compelling argument for the crucial role of networks that cut across sectoral and ideological lines in connecting people to a common cause in the darkest hours of martial law. Of course, many of these ties and friendships frayed when Marcos declared martial law, but after Marcos fell and with the decline of the Communist Party in Davao City, conviviality returned and even broken friendships mended. Duterte's war on drugs has brought back the tensions and animosities, but instead of confronting one another, I was told that these former Susanistas avoid talking about the elephant in the room to preserve quote-unquote connections that will matter in the long term. Now, this is not uncommon in many other political kin and acquaintances back home. You fight with each other during elections and when governing, but you all show up for Sunday family dinner and talk about the kids. It was no secret to many in Davao that Duterte had a good relationship with the left and other anti-Marcos groups. The DSI has only given perfunctory attention to this because, frankly, there's very little data to work with. And it does not help that many in the DSI do not speak either Visayan or Davao Tagalog, nor have spent extended amounts of time, periods of time, just immersing themselves in Davao. But the Visayan essay of Leon Bolan in Ososana may again provide us a glimpse of how this mutual accommodation between boss and cadre evolved. Leon was arrested for the third time and tortured by the military. It's in a Visayan, it's not in the Visayan, his essay. While his torturers were taking a break, he asked a visiting mayor cousin to pass on a message to his comrades in his organization, the Nationalist Alliance, which was a legal front of the Communist Party, asking them to contact Vice Mayor Duterte and ask for his help in releasing them. That same day, Duterte arrived in his village ship to escort Leon and 8 of his comrades out of the camp. He brought them to his offices, and there, away from the eyes and prying ears of media, scolded them in this endearing, metaphorical way. The mayor told them, "You knuckleheads, you know how strong the typhoon is? You should take cover first because the rains are powerful too. You will all get wet." Or in Visayan, gahi mog ulo, kusog ang bagyo, pasilong una mo, kay kusog ang ulan, o basa gyud mo. Duterte was referring to the counterinsurgency operations that the military and anti-communist militias were just starting at that time, which turned Davao into parts of Davao City into a virtual war zone. Leon and his comrades thanked Duterte, then proceeded to the local office of the task force detainees to report that they were alive. Leon's last line in the essay is about how grateful he was for what Duterte had done. Now, where did this friendship come from? So I inquired from friends in Davao City, and one of them wrote back for his daughter. Billy explained at the time that Duterte was already a member of, quote, a group of Davao pro-democracy lawyers that was in turn a part of a broad anti-fascist alliance built by the National Democratic Front at the time. Completing that group of lawyers were the non-communists Inday Santiago, look at the list, Ray Teves, Ches Doresa, the Susanistas that this PowerPoint slide would show. They were anti-Marcos and anti-communists from Davao Ateneo de Davao University who were willing to work with the party. Now, to someone familiar with the dynamics of left-wing politics at the period, at the time, this group was quite atypical, given that in Manila, the national leaderships were already trying to scratch out each other's eyes. Duterte's bromance with the left, when he was mayor, certainly complicates this picture of him as a strawman. I have another issue for which I really do not have a definitive answer, but I will speculate as a way of closing this rather long talk. And this is the question that the DSI elided. So why did Duterte become president and not, say, another local strongman like Chavit Singson? There were 3 of these local politicians who grabbed the public's attention in the first decade of this century. Chavit and Duterte, and Jesse Robredo, the former mayor of Naga City in southeastern Luzon and husband of the current vice president. Robredo died in a plane crash in June 2012, leaving us with Chavit and Duterte. Now, setting aside our motives, this is where I would like to speculate a couple of things. First, why Duterte, not Chavit? It may have to do with networks. That Duterte had a more extensive one, while Chavit was limited to the illicit and the recreational. Boxing, you know. Duterte's network may be Davao-based, but the groups in it had relationships that went beyond Davao, from the corporate sector to the Communist Party to such nationwide organization as the League of City Mayors of the Philippines, and its municipal version, the League of Municipalities of the Philippines. Duterte cultivated these ties, while Chavez's focus was the mutual accommodation he would set up with one president after another. Second, and I think my Mindanaoan friends may not be happy with this, the general view of Mindanao is that of a turbulent island where violence is the normal state ever since its inclusion into the Philippine state in 1914. But if you break down the statistics, two things stand out in the current state of violence. On the one hand, most of the fighting was happening in the Muslim zones. In other parts of the islands, the conflicts were more like small arms fires, quote unquote, ambushes and raids that had minimal effect on the stability of these areas. Davao City and the surrounding towns around were such areas. The insurgency never made any serious dent in the economic growth of the city and the region. Even the bombing of churches and public spaces in Davao itself hardly made a dent in that growth. Therefore, here was a strongman who, with a left-right coalition, who ruling a city that has become the vanguard of economic development in the islands. Singapore. Finally, the large-scale migration to Mindanao, the country's largest frontier, trickled down by the end of 1960. But the social and family ties that with the places they left never disintegrated. Social demographers noted that in many places in Mindanao, settlers, quote unquote, recreated their old towns and welcomed new migrants from the old town to a place that had lots of similarities with, quote unquote, the old country. And this served as the foundation of the so-called, quote unquote, solid South, which strongly supported Duterte in 2016. That South included the Visayan-speaking provinces of Mindanao, the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, which was a region then, if you guys remember, then dominated by the brutal Ampatuan family, who, again, if you recall, gave presidential candidate Gloria Arroyo her lead of 1 million over a presidential contender with the mass appeal, Fernando Poe Jr. And ending this at the edge of the South were the vote-rich Central Visayan provinces of Cebu, Bohol, and Southern Leyte. All these local settings continue to evolve, to develop, and I think they will play a crucial role in future national elections, including the coming one next year. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. That's all.